Welcome to day 2 of Australian Cyber Week 2022. This workshop is designed to help founders understand the cybersecurity needs they have. And what we've seen out there in the landscape in the last several months has been quite amazing with Medibank and Optus. But what I'd like to do now is hand straight over to Vertex founder and CEO, Martin Boyd, who's going to walk us through exactly how to help defend yourself. So over to you, Martin.
Perfect, thanks Tom. All right, so obviously, exactly to that point, just following on from Tom, we do obviously have a lot of cyber attacks happening. You've got Medibank, got Optus. So if you weren't aware of the issue, hopefully you are now. We're going to jump through and we're going to talk through a range of different things. Happy to take questions or if you want to bring some things into it and mix things up. So don't feel like it's just me telling you things. My aim, I've tried to take little pieces of information across a whole range of different things that we're seeing, or different attacks that we're actually seeing take place, and trying to give you the short and sweet version of, look, what you should be from a startup perspective or even from a general business perspective, because a lot of it applies, as well as from a cyber security perspective, why it's important. And happy to go into a bit more depth or answer some questions as we go through it as well, so feel free to jump in and play along. On that note, before I do jump in though, I'll just give acknowledgement of country. So just say we begin today by acknowledging the traditional custodians of this and pay respect to their elders past, present and emerging. We extend that respect to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders people attending today. Cool. We also have this thing called Slido. So if anyone wants to throw questions out there, feel free to do that. We'll also have a question time later on. But also, once again, you can just put your hand up and happy to jump in and talk through things as well. So Vertex Cybersecurity, a little bit about us. We've been around now for over 6 years, and my founding background is I used to be the executive manager of cybersecurity for CBA. I've seen it from big enterprises, and we now do cybersecurity for a lot of companies, which I'll show you one sec. But what's important is understanding why we're doing and what we're doing, because for me, this is ultimately a huge issue. People, families, businesses are under attack, and we just treat it as it's a cyber thing. For me, it's almost a bit personal. So I really care about this, and we try to show that through the values of Vertex, which is client first with heart, teamwork, honesty, always learning and innovating and automating. And so it's really important for us to make sure we're taking care of our clients. So I'll talk to you about what we do, and ultimately we do end-to-end cybersecurity for a lot of businesses. We see many companies, they call us up when they get hacked, so we see the attacks across many organizations, across many industries. So this information is a combination, a simplification across a lot, okay? So we'll keep it there. So one of the things we will do, and we've actually got some cool hackers in our team, ethical. We always like to show, does anyone want to put their hand up or share their company? It's for us to have a little bit of a look and see if we can find some vulnerabilities. The offer's out there. Feel free to put your hand up if you want to. Any takers? That's all right. If you change your mind, let me know, and we'll just find some things for you. But
I'll throw it. If you want one for that, I'll take one for the team.
You take one for the team? Yeah, sure. Sure. Team, what company is that?
Cordis Asset Management.
Cordis Asset Management. Okay. All right. Cool. So that's Tim 14 from Cordis Asset Management. All right. Cool. We'll have a quick look and we'll see what we can find for you. Okay. It's only an hour, so we can't guarantee. We always are. That's right. And if we find something too bad, we'll take it offline. So don't worry. All right. Who do we help? We help a lot of great companies. And I think one of the things to understand is there's a lot of the innovation, and I could talk about why startups are really good, but a lot of innovation comes from startups. And that's partly because in some ways they're free from history or legacy to go do something new and great. So it's really important we continue to do that. But the same part of it is they have some of the challenges of ultimately starting with nothing and having to build everything up. So they're in this unique position where it's difficult. There's some interesting stats on some of the brochures that you've got. One of them I think says startups in Australia are 300 times less funded than overseas. There's an interesting point that makes it a lot harder. But here are a variety of some of the businesses and startups that we help with our cybersecurity services. And so just to give you an idea, and I will talk about a whole bunch of things, but sometimes it's, look, I'm just the guy standing at the front, so listen to me. But what I've asked, and really polite and really nicely, one of our great clients here, Simple KYC. So Neil has actually volunteered to come and just say a couple of words about Vertex, because one thing that is it's great hearing it from me, but I think it's better to hear it from a client, because I guess the thing that I would always say is typically people in two minds when we discuss these items, either yes, they agree and they want to improve their cybersecurity at the end of this, or ultimately they think that we're twisting the truth and trying to manipulate to sell you something. So what I thought is if I get someone from my clients who can give you a bit of an insight, and then hopefully when we go through it, you'll understand where I'm coming from, why I'm explaining these things, and go from there. So Neil, if you could just go this for a couple of minutes.
Hi everyone. So yeah, I guess we've been using GIF for 2 years. Yeah. So Martin does pen testing, both automated and manual pen testing for us. Always finds a range of issues, which is good. Like we use a lot of other automated tools. Martin and his team are able to find stuff that others don't. Some are critical, some not so bad. We've also used Vertex for training as well, for internal training of our team. So we're ISO and SOC certified, which has taken a lot of work. So our company itself, we're about 110 people across 5 or 6 countries now, I think, ranging from New Zealand, Asia and across Europe into America. Our customers are the big 5 banks in Australia, plus smaller ones, internationals, American Express, ING, HSBC, Morgan Stanley and so on. So security is critical for us. As good as we think things are internally, there's always issues. We do internal developer training every year and the developers go, yeah, we know this, whatever. They always fail. Every time, as much as they think they can get it all right, they don't. You need data independence, you need stuff to be pushed. Again, because of our customers, we have a very high bar that we're required to meet. And whenever possible, we do try to exceed that. So as an example, we're required to be pen tested every year manually, but we actually automatically pen test every 2 weeks because we have a high level of paranoia. And so do our customers, which for us has also enabled us to beat some of our competitors who haven't been able to pass the bank's security requirements. Australian banks, generally, they're a lot better than what they used to be over the last 5 or 6, say compared to 5 or 6 years ago, for their level of requirements, but they're still consistently 2 to 3 years behind the US banks and what they require. Australian banks used to be just tick a box, yep, all good. American banks will come in and ask specific questions. We just got a new one, which I haven't actually shown you, last week, and they don't even do the are you ISO certified? It's like really detailed. You have to know what you're doing. You have to have everything in place. Otherwise, you can't even answer the questions. So there's no kind of skirting around things, and Vertex has helped us to do that.
Thank you so much, Neil. I really appreciate that and you taking the time. So we've been working with them and doing great things. And to be honest, it's been really great to be with them on their journey as they've grown. As you can see, they're doing amazing things now. So really cool. So on that note, hopefully you understand then, gives you a little bit of, hey, here is some of the stuff we do and understand. And there's a variety. There's smaller and there's bigger, there's a mix, but it gives you an idea. So what I want to do is I want to talk through some topics. So the first is how does this impact a startup? So obviously, I'll be honest, Neil's a great success, right? Like I think when you do cyber right and you get that stuff right, you can be amazing things. And I think that's to be within all those amazing companies and selling to all those really tough worldwide companies and locals, I think that's a great success, right? But then the other side of it is, what does it happen when it doesn't go right, when you don't do this right, and what that can look like? What is the cyber security secret sauce? So I think we're trying to demystify it a little bit because I think cybersecurity is a lot of things. And so what is it really simply? Can we just make it real simple? What are the cyber attackers doing, right? Because there's 100 things we could be doing, but why don't we actually know what they're actually doing and just make sure we make that really hard for them. So then hopefully they'll move on. And then sure. And then the other one is, as a founder or someone within the company, what are some key things you should be doing now? So if there was a priority listing, what are like the top 3 or the top 1? And then where do we go from there? And that's probably what's up, and happy to take some questions and talk through some things as we go through. Obviously, hopefully you're aware companies are being hacked. Cybersecurity is a really big issue. Here's a whole bunch of companies that have had data breached. There's more every day. I just throw it up there just to make it really sure that you understand that this is happening to all the companies out there and is important that you're doing it. And the Australian government came out and said it will cost you lots of money. They say 33% of businesses will experience a cybercrime. And they also say the average cost is $276,000. And I've actually got a point there which actually it's funny, it's one of those things, you look at that number and you go, yeah, that doesn't make sense. But I've actually got some points later on which actually reinforces that number. Okay, but we'll come back to that later. And look, it wouldn't be fair if I didn't talk briefly about the Optus and the Medibank, because everyone's talking about it. So hopefully I can talk about that and then we can focus through. But look, we'll talk briefly, but obviously Optus, the understanding of the story is they authenticated API. I think there's some assumptions that it was probably used for a legacy system or something else. And then they ultimately, it was protected by being on a separate space, a separate network. So like putting it in a separate room. And then ultimately, one day they needed access to that room for something. And then naturally, when they accessed that room, left that door open to that room, it meant that the bad guys could access all the data, all the gold within it. So it's almost like having a vault and relying all your security on one door to be all your security, right? Naturally, you'd want multiple levels of security. The short of it is, from our perspective, you need multiple layers for security. You can't just have the one, right? If you just have the one, unfortunately, when it does fail, it is going to be, it's going to impact you. The question is what's behind that door and how big the impact is going to be. Not if it will or won't happen. It's just when and how big the impact's going to be. Now, we'll talk about, obviously, as those people impacted, what we recommend to do there as well, briefly as well. The Medibank, obviously, not all the information is out, but obviously the understanding is there were credentials that were leaked and essentially they were used to gain access to restricted systems. Once again, it was restricted but just by a username and a password. And then from there, they're able to gain access to other information. Obviously, without all the information, there's some assumptions in there. But once again, it comes back to what are the multiple layers that you have in place. People throw away the two-factor often, which we will talk about in a second as well. So it comes into play that they're able to gain access and take all the data. Yeah, look, it's one of those things, and we'll talk to it in a bit, it's the attackers have the advantage. Right, so one of the things is you need to be putting enough layers in there that ultimately, that by the time they get through one door or two doors, that when they hit that third door, it's too hard, too difficult, and they're going to give up and walk away. So if you think like from a vault perspective, if you have to break through 2 or 3 safes to get to the gold, by the time you've spent hours getting through 1 safe and 2 safe, you start to give up potentially. But that's not the only thing, but we'll just keep it there at a high level. Yeah.
Just a quick question.
Yeah.
What's the protection like for these protector things, the last pass and all of that? Are they worth their weight at all?
Yeah, correct. So great question on the password managers. Yeah, we're going to talk about those. Yeah. So that's a good question. And the question is, what about password managers? Are they worth it? Are they secure? What about them? And it's a really great question. And we will talk about that one in a second. So if I can just pause it and I'll slide it into it. But it's a really good question. But because you've asked that, I'll highlight some of the points that will be really useful to it. So that's good. In short, what should you do? And really briefly, if you were involved or in those attacks, cyber attacks, ultimately, we're going to talk about it. You should make sure all your online accounts have what we call the cybersecurity foundations. And I've just coined that term, and I'm going to talk about that in like a second. So there's a couple of things that we believe are like the foundations, and I'll explain why. Contact any companies that are important to you, like banks, and tell them that your data has been compromised and that they need to be more vigilant to protect you. And then be on alert for anything suspicious, because now your details are out there and you are going to get attacks. So the other one is obviously monitor your credit score, because obviously people will potentially try to impersonate you and try and get credit on your behalf. And then obviously, if possible, change any of the compromised details, like a new license, a driver's license. And the other one is also, you need a vote, right? So if people aren't putting enough, if you don't believe they're not putting enough good cybersecurity and protecting your data, then my recommendation wouldn't be to stay with them, but to tell them that you're not happy and move to somewhere else, and use that as a voting mechanism to make this a bigger, more important factor of your decision, but also for businesses to make sure that they're actually valuing the protection of your data. So when they have to make a choice between keeping a legacy system and not spending the money to do the upgrades and the investment to secure it, or keep it, their decision becomes a lot easier for them because they know what their customers expect from them, as an example. Cool. We've talked about a lot of businesses that could be hacked and the impacts and the big ones. Interestingly, even just small ones, so startups and growing businesses, 60% of them, after a breach, die 6 months later, right? So it's huge, okay? So reputational impacts, loss of sales, as well as loss of existing customers. Not to mention, obviously, typically when you're a startup or a growing business, you're already cutting it pretty fine to begin with. So something like this can be, and 60% of the time, is the death of the company. So if we talk about impacts from a cyber attack, we've got everything ranging from business ending to very large fines. And I probably should have mentioned, I think Optus are putting aside over $120 million to pay for the costs just for the cost, without any of the other further damages for this. Cool. So let's talk about cybersecurity, and let's just simplify it for a moment, right? And really simply, let's just talk about it from the three: people, process, and technology. The reason I like to talk about those three is because when you understand from that perspective, you realize security is not this just technical thing that you just have to put in place, right? It is something that you go, all right, we've got people that are using our systems, so we need to make sure they're using it securely and they're doing their part to protect it. And then it's also, all right, the technology itself needs to be secure to make sure that there isn't a backdoor or a security vulnerability that allows them access to it. And then on top of that is, what are we doing that's the right process? Because at the end of the day, people either follow a process or they make it up. So if you want to make sure you've got a process, and you also want to make sure it's secure. So I said, let's simplify it. Wouldn't it be great if there was a cybersecurity standard that hundreds of people have worked together to build, that has used their past experience to come and create a really good standard that we could leverage or use, right? And the answer is there is. So it's called ISO 27701. So over 150 people came together and agreed, and getting 150 IT people to agree on something is hard enough, but getting them to agree on a really good standard based on their experience of things that have actually happened. They did ISO 27701, and that is a really good framework. And the thing is, though, obviously, to get 150 people agreeing on everything, they had to come up with a lot of different items so that everybody's views were taken into consideration, which is good because it takes in all the different attack scenarios. However, it ended up being 114 controls. And really simply, imagine that's 114 different things you need to do to be secure, which for a startup or anyone that's starting is a lot. And it's not to say that you shouldn't do this, but it's just to say that if this is probably the good standard that you want to aim for, where do you start? And so what I would say is rather than starting specifically purely on this, but this is obviously probably where you want to be targeting, you want to be starting on ultimately where you're going to be attacked first. Because obviously those are going to be your biggest weaknesses. Let's talk about some of the attacks that we see out there. But just before we do, I'll just highlight that the reason we've got the disadvantage, and the reason there are 114, is because as a cyber attacker, they only need to be lucky once. So if you think about it, your system, this standard has identified 114 different points of basically attack or things you should be doing to put in defenses. So if you think about it, though, only one of those needs to be vulnerable, and then potentially they gain access to your systems, right? So unfortunately, the attackers have the advantage because they only have to find one vulnerability across all of those. Whereas as a defender, as a company, you need to actually protect across all of those. So that is the disadvantage. However, the good news is I'm going to share what the attackers are doing so you can have some focused things to begin with that everyone as a startup or even as a business can do at the beginning so that they can actually be protected against the key things. And so what we see is this. So the first step is online reconnaissance. So we see the attackers are basically looking online for information about businesses they should attack, right? Which means if you're more present online, then you're more likely to be attacked. The second one is they actually use, in a lot of cases, LinkedIn and social media to try and gain information about your business. And just so what we're seeing now is if you are on their target list, or even you will see that your employees will get phishing emails within a week of being added to LinkedIn. That's what we're seeing on average in this. Just to give you a perspective, that's the starting point, is they will look at LinkedIn and online to try and understand information. So if your website has names and people's phone numbers or emails on it, I'd recommend taking those off. And obviously try to limit, what you can with the social media and LinkedIn as well. Because the next thing is they're going to take that information and, like I said, is within a week you're going to get, your staff or employees are getting phishing emails. So if you ever wondered why all your staff are getting phishing emails, you can probably trace it back to the fact that they're actually, when they added themselves to LinkedIn to your company. And there are other ways that they get that as well, but that's what we predominantly see. Obviously, there are other ways that include some of the data breaches that are out there, which give them lists of emails that the attacking can send phishing attacks to. But typically, we see that more in the consumer or individuals rather than the business space. Here's the interesting thing. The success rate is really high, and I'm going to throw some stats out on that later on the phishing attack. So typically, that's all they need to do. However, some of them, if they're unsuccessful here, will then move on to the website vulnerability and try and find website vulnerabilities. Some attackers are more skilled in this than they are in that, so they'll jump straight to the website vulnerabilities, but typically that's what they'll do. So they'll go to the website and try and find something vulnerable, and there might be something pointing to their CRM that they'll try and gain access to, there might be something else. So then work through and try and find some of that information. And so that's their go-to attack plan, okay? And just to highlight it, we see that when a company is on media more, when they're advertising, hey, we got funding, or they're advertising to get more clients, they're also advertising that information to the attackers. So it's almost like it's a signal, right? They say, hey, we just got funding. So sure, that's good for people that are interested in investments or interested in using the product, but it also tells the attackers, hey, these guys got a whole bunch of cash, come attack it. And they're new as well because they're a startup. So unfortunately, they've probably got less protection because they are playing that risk game as well. And so that's what we see. So if you're doing any of those activities which give you an online presence, then essentially, which I'll show in a second, essentially your risk factor goes up greatly, okay? You go from potentially hidden in between the scenes to obviously basically being on target. So what we suggest, if you think about it, and I will go through these a little bit detail, but ultimately from a phishing protection, we recommend these three items. For the malware protection, we recommend these ones, and platform. And this is what we call our cybersecurity foundations. I'm going to dig into those a little bit now. So I'll put this slide up back in a second as well, so don't feel like you're missing out. I did say I'll throw out some stats. From a phishing perspective, 91% of cyber attacks start from a phishing attack. 91% start from a phishing attack. And that's because it is so successful, so easy. And that's part of the people is we get hundreds of emails. We also get tired, we get hungry, we get lazy, we get busy. Ultimately, as people, one of the three is people, process, and technology. As people, we become a vulnerability. And hence why 27% is the average of people that click on phishing. So it's really high. And it's usually half or greater than that give away their username and passwords. So 15% to 30% or 15 to 27% actually give away the username and passwords. Yeah.
5% of the 27% or 10%?
Yeah, so we would say between half, so the question, just to repeat, is how many of those actually damage or hurt the company? So are successful leading to an attack perspective. So what we would see, so obviously these numbers, a lot of them, because we don't see all the phishing attacks. So a lot of these numbers are actually generated from test phishing attacks. But what we do see known from test phishing attacks is about half of this, so between 15 and 20%, are actually successful at getting details and passwords to actually attack them. What we see in the real world, there are a huge number of phishing out there. But from an attacker's perspective, because they're doing a lot of them in bulk, for them, they don't count when they send out, say, 1,000 to 1,000 different people, that is 1,000 emails. They feel like that's one bulk email group, right? So from them, they get an success rate almost every time they're doing their bulk emails out. But from a percentage perspective, what you're asking is how many of the 27% would actually be successful in their attack? Look, considering 15% of them are actually giving them actual login details, and we see that, I would say you're looking potentially at least half of that, so 7.5% to 15% would be a successful attack perspective based on our experience. So in short, the numbers don't match between the two statistics, but ultimately from what we see, considering that so many are given out, many do provide that access and successful attack, which is very high.
What a lot of the cyber reports that are going out mainly saying is the filters have gone down in terms of successful attacks and other approaches becoming more successful. Is that
Yeah, so I'll just repeat that. What you're saying is what some other people are saying is the trend is that the attackers are being less successful in the phishing attacks, so they're moving to other attacks because they're being less successful. To that, and the question is what are we seeing? So ultimately, we are still seeing them being very successful from phishing attacks. So we're still getting called up from companies that have been attacked by phishing attacks, people that have said that they would never being hacked from a phishing attack, being hacked by phishing attacks. Look, I think there is a movement and a shift. We are definitely seeing more people moving to ransomware, and not because the phishing isn't successful, but more for the fact that it's less financially successful. Because naturally, once you gain access to someone's account with their email, you then still need to convince someone to transfer money out. Whereas the ransomware tends to have a higher success rate of someone paying money. So from that perspective, we are seeing a shift in more ransomware, but not because phishing isn't successful at gaining access, just because it's less successful at getting the money out, if that makes sense. And I think what you'll do is we'll just see shifts in waves back and forth between these because they're still both quite successful. One of the items that I talked about was training. So as part of the foundations, training is super important because if your employees, if your company, if you're not trained to know what to do, then how do you expect to do the right thing? It's one of those things is everyone has training how to cross a road, right? Look left, look right, look left again, right? No one has training how to be cybersecurity safe on the internet. So it's like a fundamental education that everyone's missing. And if you don't have that, then the chances of you doing the right thing are low. The other one is, we talked about passwords and password managers and 2FA. So what we've ultimately learned is the brain is not good at remembering passwords. And it's really simple. You either A, have a password manager, which allows you to use lots of different passwords for all your different websites, or B, you're trying to remember a password and you're using the same or a very similar password across everything. Okay? The problem with that approach is when you get hacked or lose one password, you then also lose access potentially to all the other accounts. And that's what we see, obviously, when they get a password, they use that to log into as many accounts as they can and try and gain, either do as much damage or try and gain as much access to it. So to reduce that password risk, you need to then have lots of passwords. And the brain does not remember lots of passwords, so you have to use a password manager. The question, so coming back to Tim's question earlier on, are password managers safe? They actually, so the way the password managers work, the good secure ones, like Bitwarden or LastPass, is they'll use your password that you use to log into them to encrypt your other passwords. So the actual company themselves can't actually access your passwords. Now, naturally, it does mean, though, that if someone gains access to that one password that you have, then they could get access to all the others. So there is that risk, which is why we also recommend you have 2FA. And we recommend the hardware 2FA tokens. The FIDO2 is the standard, but YubiKey is one of the manufacturers of them, but there are a number of others. And we recommend you use those with your password and use that not only with your password manager to provide a second layer of protection, but also with your other logins such as your Office 365, your Gmail and the sorts. Yeah. Yeah, good question. So the question is, why do we recommend the hardware token over the Authenticator app? And this is one of the things is the trend that we're seeing is, talk about hackers and trends, they're realizing that more and more people are moving to two-factor in apps, and ultimately they're finding ways to work around it. So the success rates against two-factor is actually increasing, except for against the two-factor that use the hardware tokens. So what we are seeing is the hardware tokens, the only two-factor that is really stopping the bad guys. Yeah, sure. Yeah, sure. So the question is, could you be a bit more specific on how they're getting around the two-factor, like the Google Authenticator on the phone? And so there's generally two apps that you use on the phone as an example, right? There's the one which will give you a token or a code, and they're called TOTP. That token and code, you actually type into the website, right? Which you use the keyboard for. So if the attacks that you would use against that, i.e. if it's a phishing attack, if it pops up and asks for your two-factor authentication code, if you're tricked into typing the website, your username and password, you're going to type in your two-factor code too. And so you've given them all away. The only thing from their perspective is you're not, because, so these specific ones, so you might be thinking about a YubiKey which has TOTP. I'm talking specifically about, and it gets a little bit complicated because some of these devices do a bunch of different things, including the TOTP. But what I'm talking specifically about is the FIDO2 standard. What it does in a really abbreviated form is it takes the URL into the hardware token, encrypts it, and basically pushes out like a password or a key out the other end back to the website. What that means is it's specific to the URL, and also obviously it uses lovely encryption methods to make sure that number that comes out to it is essentially secure. So with those two methods that it does, it means that If you go to a phishing website, the phishing website gets a key, but it's specific to that URL, and therefore resistant to that specific attack.
Sorry, to be the devil's advocate,
Sure.
if I'm tricked into putting the code for my phone, could I not be tricked with my YubiKey in to do that?
Yeah, so the question there is, if I could be tricked with my phone to type in the code, could I not be tricked to plug in the YubiKey? And once again, yes, but the way the YubiKey works is it takes the URL of the website in, and it uses that to generate the output. So what that means is the TOTP you have on your code, that number works, and you put it in, and it can be into the phishing website, and then can also be used in the actual original website. Whereas the YubiKey, when it generates a key, that key can only be used with that URL. So if you go to the phishing website, sure, it will generate a key that can be used for it, but that key cannot then be used over on the actual original website. Does that make sense now? Yeah, cool. Awesome. Yeah, question. Great question. So what happens if you use that YubiKey? So the first is we actually recommend you have a backup in most cases so you don't lose it. Secondly, ideally, you've got multiple people or admins so that can basically reassign or your accounts. But obviously, if you're the only one and you only have one key and you lose it, then yes, you lose your access. But most companies have ways for you to gain access over a long period process if you lose it, but it's not a pretty or easy process. So in short, we would not recommend that, and we'd recommend you have a backup so that way you're covered.
If I understood you said LastPass encrypts your database, if you don't have the YubiKey, you lost your database.
So the interesting thing is it encrypts it with the password, and then it adds the YubiKey. Sorry, I will repeat that. So you said that LastPass encrypts your database, but if you lose your YubiKey, then your database is encrypted, so you can't gain access to it. And the answer to that is the YubiKey isn't used as part of the encryption of the password of your passwords in LastPass or Bitwarden. Your password is. But what they do is they add that two-factor as essentially a extra step that you need to do to log in and gain access to it. So in that case, you're still technically okay. But yes, once again, I recommend you have a backup. Yeah.
So this is great for commercial users, for industry users, for business users. A lot of startups are building products for end.
Yes.
A lot of startups are building software and applications for end users, potentially not commercial users. Can you recommend or give some advice to people who are like using a banking app? They're not going to have a hardware token sitting in their wallet because they're doing some transfers from their mobile app, even though they may have two-factor. I know that just maybe a little bit about the risks around that and how they could potentially manage those concerns as well.
Yeah, so you started, so just before you got the mic, you just started with saying, yeah, look, this is great for a lot of businesses, but you're saying, and if I can just try and confirm what you're saying for some people it's not viable because they don't have access to one, or?
For end users, for consumers.
For consumers, yes.
So 70-year-old lady wants to use a banking app.
Yes.
You know, they're not going to walk around with a hardware token to do a bank transaction or transfer money to the grandchild for $50 because can you talk a little bit about how 2FA can work in
those instances?
That space?
Yeah, sure. So in a lot of spaces, and it is a usability and security aspect, and obviously we are seeing, so if you talk about trends, we're seeing the shift towards the hardware tokens generally across the business side because of the things we just talked about. From the consumer side, we are seeing a shift to 2FA, but we're seeing the shift to 2FA really for on the mobiles, so the SMS 2FAs. And so what that is when you do a bank transfer, a lot of times you'll then get an SMS token that you'll need to use to confirm that bank transfer. So that's where we see it at the moment. I do see over time, as the population carries on, I do foresee that the hardware tokens will actually move into and shift into the consumer space and be part of that two-factor. But for the moment, a lot of it will be around the SMS, the token. Some of them are coming into play with using the apps. Once again, though, there's a usability issue with some of the older people that don't have access to use those mobile apps. So naturally, they still have the backup option of the SMS for the two-factor. And so ultimately, the idea is though when you do that transfer with that two-factor step, you'll get an SMS you put the number in off your SMS, or if you've got the bank app, you'll have to push accept. Or once again, the app will give you a code, a number, and you'll type that in again. So that's what we're seeing. Yeah. That's all right.
This is all very nice for established systems when we've got everything in place and you set up two-factor. But we've seen the last two big hacks that have hit the media being sysadmin, username, password, that's all they had. In they went. And that's largely because, as we all know who've got a technical background, username, password for operational admin accounts tends to be the norm rather than the exception. And two-factor often, particularly when you get into local admin rights and so forth on boxes, you don't have two-factor behind that. You might have the idea that you're inside someone's network or coming from a certain IP address as just banal second factor. But there's a lot of places in the real world when you're trying to manage and operate and set up, and startup land particularly, systems, two-factor doesn't exist. And that's the nature of developing software. There's a lot of places you don't have two-factor. Only in the end systems when we've set them all up. How do you deal with that?
Yeah, so look, good question. Interestingly, a lot of all the major operating systems are supporting now two-factor by these hardware tokens. So technically, it's actually now an option to do that. Question is, obviously, like you said, is a lot of people still aren't doing it. And part of that is an education piece. Part of it is also actually moving towards not just trying to do two-factor for all these options, but also looking to move towards more automation. So you've got essentially processes and technologies, steps in place so that a single person can't just use their login credentials and cause havoc to it all. But once again, that requires time, effort, and the sorts. But so what you're probably talking to is, yeah.
Sorry. Personalised two-factor for devices when you've got 20 sysadmins means you've gone and set up the second factor on that device 20 times.
Yeah, but you've had to set those users up 20 times anyway, but yeah. Look, and here's the great thing, right? So what you're talking about is usability versus security. So you're basically saying people will take the shorter, easier way and make themselves vulnerable than they will make the security. And part of that comes back to you've got to make a decision, right? Do you want to be one of the companies on the front news or vulnerable, or do you want to put in the extra time and effort? What I'm talking about here are the things that actually, when you add up the amount of time it would take you to do, and put it down on paper versus the protection you get, the ROI on that time and investment is really good and really effective. Don't get me wrong, I'm not saying this doesn't take time, and it isn't, but the benefit of it makes it worth it. And ultimately, we are seeing a big shift in the industry, the technology, to be supporting this available to make this as a clear option. There are other solutions as well around that, you can do that as well. But yeah, look, there are multiple. And once again, it comes back to layers, right? So if your only layer is a user and password, then potentially, once again, you haven't applied layers. So you need to be looking, okay, maybe you don't want to apply two-factor because it doesn't work for you. But then you go, all right. But then you go, oh, I want to do two-factor I'll add a restriction on the IPs and on the network level, right? And so I'll add other layers in different ways. But obviously, look, it's one of those things there's always a balance, security, usability, and cost. So what this has done is I've guys really briefly, what are the things you basically have a really low cost and effort, have a really easy usability, and have really great security. So that's why I call it the foundations. Do these things as your first starting foundations and get the benefit. And then there are other things that you should be doing, we should talk about, and I've got a slide on that too. But obviously, it's start with the important things first. So I also talked about browser, so with phishing perspective. Unfortunately, people make mistakes and click on the wrong link, so you need some protection in the browser. XSurfLog is an example of something like that. That's something that we do sell. We sell solutions for all of these, but I'm just talking higher level as a general. So whether it's our solutions or you go to a third party, you at least know what we're recommending and what you should be doing out there. And look, really in short, what you want something in the browser. So when someone does accidentally click that phishing link or the sorts, you've got it logged and you've got something there in to protect you and reduce that risk. Because unfortunately, people do get tired, angry, busy, and they do make mistakes. So you want an extra, once again, a layer in there to protect. The other major risk we're seeing out there is obviously malware and ransomware. So from that perspective, we're recommending obviously making sure you have a good antivirus, and the other one is good email filtering. And so that's where we actually call out Office 365 specifically, because their email filtering is not what we believe good enough to protect the businesses, the phishing attacks. Pretty much most of the calls we get from someone getting phishing or malware through their email, they're using Office 365. So that's why we recommend you have extra protection. Yeah, so the question is, am I saying Gmail is better? So in the short is Office 365, once you charge you money for security, Gmail build it in by default. And the short answer is it means yes, by default, Gmail's security on email is better. The other one is your platform, your website. Remember we're talking about the attacks. So the next attack they would do is try to attack your website. So rather than waiting for them to attack your website, you pay someone to attack it for you, someone like Vertex, to actually find the vulnerabilities before the bad guys do. So that way then you can fix them, right? And that's called penetration testing. And that's when we put on the hat as the bad guy to try and find those vulnerabilities for you. And so so I said I'll show you this slide again. So here it is. So basically you can see there, so for the phishing protection, we talked about training, password managers and 2FA, the browser protection or XFlog, the malware protection, we talked about antivirus, and then we talked about the email filtering for Office 365. And then the last one, obviously, for your platform, for your website, for your system, we talked about penetration testing. And these are not an exclusive everything list. This is what we are basically saying as a minimum you should be doing if you don't want to be basically hacked, if you don't want to be hit by ransomware, if you don't want to be phished. You need to be doing these things. And there's multiple, because there's multiple layers, right? So it's not just cool. So if you're not doing this, if you're not doing these things, are you sitting on a ticking time bomb? And the answer is yes. Okay, because basically I've given you their playbook, that's their attack. If you're not putting these protections in, you are basically waiting for them to test you and to find those vulnerabilities and to compromise you and hurt you, basically. And you have to also put it from their perspective. They don't look at it as a business as you look at it with all its complexities and people and processes. And they look at it as ultimately a bucket of money. And have they put a lock on that bucket of money? And if they haven't, it's basically, from my perspective, an open door. It's from their hacker's perspective, it's an open door for them to come in and attack that. Okay. And just to give you an example, we explain this minimum kind of foundations to a lot of companies, a lot of startups. And some we've said to them, hey, look, this is what you should do. We think it's important. And we've had companies, many of them have turned around and says, no, we think you're wrong. We don't think you know what you're talking about. No, we think we'll be safe from cybersecurity. We think we're really good at this. And then we've had calls later, and this has happened multiple times. We've had calls later, 4 months later, 6 months later, and usually once again doing a lot of either advertising or in the news a lot for whatever reason. And so one example was they called us 4 or 5 months later and had lost over $300,000 in the cyber attack. It's not like, so this is unfortunately what we see as the pattern. And if you're not doing these things, this pattern will apply to you. I did say there's a bit more. So if I talked about really high level, what would be the forward on progress from there? So I talked about the cybersecurity foundations. I'll jump over this side this time. Talked about the cybersecurity foundations. Before you do the cybersecurity foundations, obviously the first thing I'd actually recommend is the training, but that is part of the cybersecurity foundations. Then remember, then you're basically on a journey or a pathway along towards ISO 27001. Some of the things that you'd have to deal with are your environment and your developer security and your admins, which is and your access and your device security, which is also some of the stuff you were talking about. So the access to the servers, access to your environments. Then we talk about, then you probably want to look at your supply risk. So what suppliers are you using? Are they putting you at risk? Have they got good security? Then you want to start to increase that maturity and start to document things. So have your policies and your procedures and your risk. And then naturally, you'll probably look to get ISO certification. And that journey will be different for every company, every startup, but that's probably at a rough estimate. And then for some companies, then you'll move towards the SOC 2 certification. That's probably, in a nutshell, really simplified version of what we would see going. And it differs, and every company is a bit different, but when I'm talking to you all in bulk like this, I give you a high-level version of what we see and where it's going. And that's where, ultimately, you get to that point where you actually have good cybersecurity, also known as basically ISO 27001. There are other standards out there. They're all plus or minus very similar in many regards, but a lot of them pull from ISO 27001. So obviously, that's why we recommend that one as the key one, an international standard. So, to help you get started, we're offering everyone here free cybersecurity training for 3 months. And all you have to use is the key CyberSafe if you're interested. Just to put in perspective, to understand from our perspective, we are so committed to cybersecurity, trying to help companies. So one of the things that we are doing is we are offering our cybersecurity training for those that can't get it or don't have the funding to get it. And so for not-for-profits that are registered charities, we will actually give it to them for free. So that's how important this is for us. This is how committed we are to do it. So hopefully you understand, if you're coming to be part of Vertex, understand the bigger ecosystem and what we're trying to do here and help. So I think we're running out of time. We did ask, thank you Tim, to give us some vulnerabilities. Just have a quick look here. I've got a number of email accounts and I've also identified some passwords here as well. So I might have to take this one offline, but I think I might just close that window so it's not on the screen. But look, I think, and due to time, we might have to leave it there. I don't want to raise those things in the open public, but I guess what I did want to highlight is there is open information out there, right? So with all these breaches, once again, if you use that same password in lots of places and you do and get hacked, then we can gain access to it. Your website, if it hasn't been tested, it's highly likely someone's made a mistake in your website or your platform, and then we'll gain access to it. And it's surprising what we can find within a short amount of time. Once again, really, look, we provide a range of services. So if you need help in any of your cybersecurity journey, feel free to reach out. We're happy to chat. As you can see, we're sharing our information, trying to help everyone on their journey. And some of it is we'll just point you in the right direction. Some of it is we're here to help. So feel free to reach out and have a chat. And I think we have questions. I think we've done questions as we've gone along, so I think we're all good for that. And otherwise, I think I'll hand it back over from there. So thank you, guys.
Big thank you for Martin, everyone. Thank you very much. Thank you, Tim, as well. I think it is really important to understand exactly what's just happened here, and it's clear that maybe not all of you even realise what's available out there on the internet. One of the things that has changed, I know there was a bit of conversation about the friction, but this is now the problem. You lose this, or your token, and your life gets very difficult. However, this is stopping. I had to reset a whole bunch of stuff yesterday, and I was able to do it through my phone, and it stopped kind of people getting in. As the lead up to Cyber Week has happened, we've seen a raised attention on our brand and the Stone and Chalk brand. We prepared for this, but not every company has. And coming back, Medibank had user credentials without two-factor authentication. So this can happen at the biggest companies out there as well. You guys are emerging tech companies. You get this stuff right. I understand it feels difficult in the beginning, but downstream, it can literally destroy a business. Thank you very much to Martin for offering up his services for free. I'd highly recommend you jumping onto that platform and having a go. So thank you very much for everyone.